On the wrong path. The first shadows fell over the forest area at the Bösenbach. Only a few walkers still lined the path, which was lost in the dark branches. An older woman walked past, her hands buried deep in her coat pockets. When she noticed Schleifer, this massive giant, standing alone at the bench, she looked at him appraisingly without slowing her pace. She walked on briskly and he insulted her in a whisper in private. With the darkness came the cold. And with the cold, the mistrust that gnawed at the last fibers of his patience returned. Where was she? She hadn't told him the time, he didn't have her number. It was agreed that she would pick him up at the bank before the sun went down. Where he met her a week ago. The minutes passed painfully and so did the hope for the promised meeting. Until suddenly noises echoed across the path. A glimpse full of hope, but it was just a young jogger. She wore tight leggings and bright sneakers and had her blonde hair tied in a braid. At the sight of this, Grinders inevitably flooded with memories of that night, where to so quickly? A kiss. The jogger disappeared into the ravines of surrounding darkness as Schleifer watched her go like a lost ghost. The icy wind of the end of winter made the treetops tremble. In daylight one could admire a considerable part of the forest to the east from this hill. To the west was the small town that was named after the body of water of the same name. The Bösenbach, which was actually not a stream but a small river, ran through the foothills of the residential areas in thin paths. In the twilight, all that was visible was the pale lighting of the houses. Far away, the darkness had quickly engulfed the rest of the country. The lantern beside the bench flickered uncertainly before revealing a shabby sliver of light that promised more shadow than clarity. The bench had paint that had long since peeled off. In the middle of it was a plaque covered in rust spots, the inscription on which was illegible. Next to it, a deformed circle adorned the surface, carved by someone who had probably tried to carve a smiley face or the crest of their favorite team into the bench, an attempt that failed miserably. The scraggly lines showed little skill, but they found their way back to the starting point via a detour and completed the sad attempt. No one climbed the sloping path, and increasingly his frustration was smoldering like a poisonous fire. Only the sounds of the forest now filled the air. Cracking, crackling, squeaking wails, emitted by who knows which animal. In between, the rattling of the lighter could occasionally be heard as Schleifer laboriously lit the next cigarette. He imagined young people coming up here in the summer to have a good time. How they sat on the bench, smoked joints and listened to loud music. There wasn't much else to discover in the sleepy little town at the end of the road. The empty streets and the poor restaurants were symbolic of the dreary monotony of a small town where no one wanted to live. He ended up in Bösenbach because he got a job here very quickly, which wasn't easy without having completed vocational training. He was hired as a driver for a pharmacy delivery service and had to drive samples from A to B 8 hours a day. Not a dream job, but at least it's better than rotting in prison. And when he left his already hated homeland, the desire to seriously start again began. One very last time. Schleifer lived in the same small town in the Vulkaneifel for 32 years. His grandfather, who was a hunter, often took him into the nearby forests. The only beautiful memory of his childhood. The reason why the choice fell on Bösenbach was probably because the small town bordered directly on the Kellerwald Mountains and therefore seemed a little familiar. At that time, the joy of life ended abruptly with the death of his grandfather, who left him only a terrible mother apart from his beloved hunting knife. This time the entertaining optimism was lost in the typical mixture of oxycodone and beer. Although the combination worked wonders against spiraling thoughts, it became a paralyzing enemy in everyday life that steadily took its toll. And so the restart went exactly as he had feared. His boss, a grumpy woman in her 50s, and his few colleagues in the laboratory were reserved towards him. No matter what nice charisma he tried to put on, the people around him remained at a cool distance. It has always been like this. At school, at work, in the nightlife, and it was the same today, even though he Dreamed the opposite. Even though he had dreamed of the opposite as a child. Schleifer was cold and decided to return to the small old apartment. He had been naive and out of touch with reality, but life had taught him so often that happiness was meant for others. The bitter realization that his new beginning was in danger of failing pushed him further towards the abyss. Last week he found himself in front of this very bench, drawn to the light like an insect. He didn't want it. He didn't want to have to think about what a hideous monster he was. Kiss me, come on. In the darkest hour, when the urge to do it again grew, she had suddenly been there, sat down next to him and asked what he was thinking about. Just like that. Her eyes shone bright blue and flooded his battered heart with hope. They talked for hours about all sorts of nonsense without any awkward silence. She seemed to understand him immediately. Undoubtedly they were on the same wavelength. She made him laugh several times with unexpectedly rude remarks that contrasted with her lovely appearance. Since then, his thoughts have only been about her. She didn't want to reveal her name because it was a secret. She also didn't give him her number because otherwise it would be boring. He liked her extraordinary nature, her beautiful appearance, her most self-confident demeanor, and when she told him to wait here in a week because she wanted to show him a special place, Schleifer was finally done. Constructs such as kindred spirits and encounters of fate quickly emerged in his thoughts, which was hardly surprising given the lack of comparable encounters. No woman had ever approached him before. He had never been granted the happiness that shone in her beauty. He's never felt like he could be himself right away. And when he thought about it, bitter loneliness enveloped him. He walked down the path into the darkness of a strange city. It was time to go. Maybe the self-pity was too present at that moment. Perhaps the crackling of the branches as they were blown around by the wind was also to blame. In any case, he didn't hear a single sound beforehand, not the slightest sound. Until he noticed a quick scurrying out of the corner of his eye, which he first thought was an animal. He was just able to turn his head when something hissed in his ear, "Hey!" It was like suddenly grabbing a high-current cable. Schleifer jumped so hard that his cell phone fell out of his hand. He stood there looking at her in complete confusion. Only after a few seconds did the puzzle pieces come together. "You," he stammered. She beamed cheekily at him. "You really scared me," he said finally, not noticing how his pinched mouth turned into a wide grin. "Yeah, I noticed. Where are you from?" "I didn't hear anything. I was still out for a walk, I went a little too far. And when I saw you sneaking down the mountain like that." She grinned furtively again. "You'll get that back," he said and laughed. It was a hearty and honest laugh. The laugh of a man in love. "Try," she replied dryly. Even though it was 5 degrees at most and the wind was stinging like an angry wasp, she wore only a thin coat. Her hair danced in the wind and through the darkness he saw the sparkle of her blue eyes. "Aren't you cold?" asked Schleifer, who was wearing an expensive puffered jacket himself. "You just have to keep moving. So maybe we shouldn't stand around so stupidly." "Okay," he replied, without really thinking about what she had even said. Her voice was magically soft, she could talk about how the world was ending and he would just stand there and nod contentedly. "Now you can't show me the place." "Why not?" she asked. "Are you afraid of the dark?" Before he could answer, she took his hand and did a pirouette. "It's most beautiful there at night." It later dawned on him that any memory of what happened next was hazy and opaque. The next thing he knew, they were already deep into the forest, surrounded by dark giant trees. She led the way, holding his hand. The touch of her soft skin made him nervous and happy at the same time. Branches cracked under her shoes. Nocturnal forest dwellers squeaked. Every bush, everyone. Bush harbored a rustling sound. Occasionally a shimmering puddle on the ground stood out against the total darkness. He could barely see a meter ahead, but he didn't care at all. Her hand, he never wanted to let go of her delicate fingers again. Her scent carried the hint of fresh summer flowers. The loud cry of an eagle owl, which must have been very close, pulled him back into the action. Only then did he really realize again that it was damn cold and that he was trudging through a pitch-dark forest. Not a word was spoken. Up to this point it felt familiar, as if there was a secret between them that they had to keep hidden from the trees. He briefly felt uneasy. How did they get here so quickly? She marched forward with great determination, this stranger shrouded in darkness. Irrational thoughts seized him and he imagined that there might be men lurking around the next bend, ready to rob him or steal his organs. He watched her figure with concentration. Was she really that big? Her shadow seemed enormous in the darkness, but it only reached his shoulder at most. Suddenly it was as if he was holding the hand of a full-grown man. Their vague outlines made no sense, her shoulders sl.